Hello. We're happy today to have Don Ross with us, who will be discussing topics from the writings of Arthur Adkins. Don received his BA from Wake Forest University, his MA from the University of Iowa, and his PhD from the University of Chicago. At Chicago, he was the first philosophy graduate student to work with Adkins. Don has since taught philosophy at George Mason University, the University of Maryland, Georgetown University, and Marymount University. He is currently in the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at American University and Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Don.
Thank you.
My leadoff question is whether theoria is dominant or an inclusive end. What do you have to say?
Okay. Well, let me back up a little bit and just talk about, as a lead into this, how dependent I am on my studies with Arthur Adkins. As you pointed out, he came to Chicago at the same time I did, and immediately I didn't know he was going to be there. And immediately I signed up for all his courses. And when I hit my third year, he then became my primary dissertation advisor. So I spent hours and hours with him, many of those in his office, one-on-one, reading Greek. And I look back and I think, how many people in the world have had the privilege of studying with a world-class scholar? Not many. I am so lucky. The other thing I want to say as a matter of preliminaries is, in some ways there are two kinds of teachers. There are teachers who teach doctrine, and there are teachers, but the better ones teach skills. The lesser teachers, the ones who teach doctrine, I guess, expect you to follow their orthodoxy. But the ones who teach skills are not particularly concerned whether you actually wind up agreeing with them or not. What's important to them is that you've acquired the skills to think for yourself. And Adkins was that latter kind of teacher, one who could impart skills. And I say this as a preliminary because when I talk about the one essay about praxis and theoria, as a matter of fact, I have come to different conclusions from Professor Adkins. But those conclusions in some ways are based on him because he taught me the skills to think these things through for myself. Let me explain what the question is asking first, and then I'll try to answer it. The question was, is theoria a dominant or an inclusive end? And to understand that question, we have to understand the structure of the Nicomachean ethics as a whole. The ethics as a whole was 10 books long, of course, but I think of book 1 and the last 4 chapters of book 10 as being like the bookends of the work. And the first book is like an introduction. The last 4 chapters of book 10 are like the conclusion of the ethics, and everything in between is a detailed study of certain aspects of ethics. Book 1 has 2 goals in mind. One of them is conceptual analysis, and this is where my study with Adkins really has paid off, and paid off in spades. Whenever I teach it, I'm able to convey a lot fuller understanding of book 1. Aristotle begins in chapter 1 by that famous quote: "Every art and every inquiry, every action and pursuit aims at some agathon, aims at some good," and that, of course, ties it in with his teleological worldview. And then, so the question is, then what is it that's good for human beings? And in chapter 4, he says, well, everybody thinks it's eudaimonia, and that's usually translated happiness. Okay. And then you come to chapter 7, and he says, well, that may be a truism, and so we really need to explore the question more deeply. And then he finally defines happiness as an activity of the soul in accordance with arete, translated virtue, but Adkins liked to translate it excellence. And if there's more than one, in accordance with the best and most teleos, the most complete, final, perfect, whatever your favorite translation is. If an English speaker was reading that book without the benefit of somebody like Adkins to explain the Greek terminology, that person would be widely misled, I'm sure. And that's because of the pervasiveness of things like utilitarian ideas If somebody is reading the word good in English applied to people or virtue in English applied to people, somebody's immediately going to think that's narrowed down to moral virtue and moral goods. If somebody sees the word happiness, well, the utilitarians use the word happiness all the time, and for them, happiness was pleasure, so you're going to really get way off base if you don't understand the nuances of the Greek words. And of course, that was one of Adkins's great fortes, is to be able to pinpoint exactly what those words meant. So you learn, if you study with him, you learn that agathos is, as you love to say, an ideal specimen of one's kind. It's broader than the just moral good. If you and arte, well, that's the fulfillment of a thing's function. A knife can have an arte, so it's not confined to moral things. And eudaimonia is a much more objective assessment of a life. It's not having fun or being pleased with oneself or something like that. So anyway, when you understand the meanings of those words, then you realize that they overlap an awful lot. So then the question arises, well, concretely, what do we do? And this is the second theme in book 1, where he says, and this is in chapters 5 and 8 and 13 mainly, he says, there are really 4 candidates for the good life. There's 3 life plans. There's the life of enjoyment, there's the life of the political life, the social life, I'm going to call it praxis, was Adkins' word. And then there's theoria, contemplation, the contemplative life. Oh, and by the way, Aristotle says, there's also external goods. You need those in order to be able to function. To be generous, you got to have something to be generous with, for example. Well, anyway, those 4 candidates for the good life really define the structure of everything in between the bookends. So the first 5 chapter books 2 through 5, the first 10 chapters of book 7 all deal with the social life. The last 4 chapters of book 7, first 5 of book 10 are on about pleasure. Book 6 is intellectual virtue, of which theoria is one. And then books 8 and 9 on philia, friendship. Friendship is said to be the greatest of the external good. So he's covered all the bases. And then you get to those 4 final chapters of book 10, the first 3 of which Aristotle is asking himself the question, can I rank these things? And he leaves aside external goods, but then those 3 life plans. Can I rank those 3 life plans? Yes, I can, says Aristotle. Number 1 is theoria. Number 2 is praxis. And a distant third is the life of enjoyment or amusement, something like that. Well, then given all that, this is what Adkins used to say, and this is zeroing in on what the question means. This is what Adkins used to say. He says, okay, suppose you're sitting in your study and you're contemplating, and you see a child fall in the swimming pool next door. What does Aristotle's moral theory say you should do? And Adkins says, well, then you think to yourself, okay, well now happiness is activity in accordance with virtue, and if there's more than one, and there is more than one, in accordance with the best one, the most final one, what's that? Well, it's theoria. So I should go back to my contemplation. So that's the dominant end view, that whenever you have a choice, if it's a choice between theoria and anything else, you choose theoria. The inclusive end interpretation is that Aristotle is advocating a sort of a well-rounded life, and the predominant element should be theoria, but not to the exclusion of other things. And I happen to agree with the inclusive end interpretation, whereas Adkins is a dominant ender. Now, let me give you 3 quick arguments for the inclusive end. Argument number 1, if you go back, obviously Adkins is relying a lot on that definition of eudaimonia in chapter 7 of book 1, but he only quoted the first half of it. If you look at the rest of it, the very next clause after saying it's the activity and soul in accordance with virtue and the best and most final, Aristotle says, well, also in a complete life, for one swallow does not make a summer, nor does one day, and neither does one day or a short time make a person karios and eudaimon, blessed and happy. So you're looking at a life as a whole. You can't make the evaluation till all the data are in. But if you're looking at a life as a whole, that doesn't mean that every single thing you do in that life has to be theoria. In other words, that's basically a logical fallacy. It's a fallacy of division. An attribute that applies to something as a whole doesn't mean that it also applies to every single part of the whole. So the fact that the life as a whole should be a theoreticus bios does not mean that everything you do in that life when you have a choice is theoria over, as opposed to everything else. Argument number 2. Aristotle is very clear that it's fine to interrupt theoria if you're tired, if you need to relax. So in other words, I can interrupt, it's fine to interrupt my contemplation to go watch a movie, to relax on. And my question is, well, if it's fine to interrupt your theoria to watch a movie, which is way down on the scale of important things, surely it's fine to interrupt your theoria to save a kid from falling in the swimming pool, And Adkins kind of admits that anyway. I mean, when you get to the third section of his essay, he's talking about praxis, the books on praxis. And, and he concedes that things are going in that direction there. But my question then is, why don't you apply that to the interpretation of the latter part of book 10 then? And Aristotle himself even points out that not to do what you should do when you should do it is just as bad as doing something you shouldn't do. In other words, not saving the kid is just as bad as my going out and drowning him. Well, anyway, so argument number 3, real quick. The very last chapter of the Eudemian ethics is actually, I think, clearer on the inclusive end side. Adkins cites it, but he only cites the last part of it. And once again, you got to look at the whole thing. The Eudemian ethics starts off talking about kalokagathia versus ta'agatha. That's the beautiful and the noble and the good. That's the Eudemian word for what in Nicomachean ethics we call moral virtue, and ta'agatha, the external goods. And then he goes on to briefly mention pleasure. And at the very end, he writes an encomium to the life of the therapeia and theoria of God, the service and contemplation of God. So you got all 4 candidates for the good life mentioned there, but it gives the impression of being a much more well-rounded life in which all 4 appear. It may be the fact, well, it's definitely the case that Aristotle thinks the predominant one should be theoria, but not to the exclusion of the other 3. So those are my 3 arguments. I suspect that the reason I come to a different conclusion is because, Adkins was a philologist and I'm a philosopher. So, I think that's one of the reasons we seem to diverge. So
that could lead us to a follow-up question here is how do philosophical and philological interpretations of a text tend to differ?
Oh, yeah, well, okay. A philosopher, first and foremost, is asking, I'm speaking for myself, and I'm also, I think, speaking for Aristotle, but when I read a philosophical work, I want to learn from it. Philosopher is asking, what can I learn from this text? And therefore, the philosopher is asking also the question, what's the most plausible construal I can place on this text? But the philologist is focusing more on the language, I think, and is asking what's the most likely meanings of these words here. So the philosopher is kind of focusing on arguments, philologist on language. Also, another thing, I think, and oh, by the way, Aristotle also, I remember I said this is true of Aristotle. Aristotle really is a paragon as far as trying to apply the principle of charity to interpret text. Look at how he handles Socrates. He certainly doesn't agree with the Socratic paradoxes, but he tries his utmost to understand what Socrates was thinking when Socrates said, for example, nobody does evil voluntarily. What was he thinking? Maybe I can look. He wasn't a dummy, so he must have had some grasped some important thing. I need to understand that. Secondly, I think philosophers tend to look at the text as a whole. Adkins, being a typical philologist, I think looks at it in a much more fragmented way. I mean, for example, my second objection to the dominant in theory was, okay, in all these books on praxis and the Nicomachean Ethics, he seems to be going in an inclusive direction. And my question is, why don't you apply that to the interpretation of theoria in book 10? But Adkins tends to, being a philologist, tends to ask the question, well, what do these words mean in this location? What do they mean in this location? Oh, well, they don't mean the same thing. A philosopher tends to look at it more holistically, I think. And then again, another difference too, I think that comes to mind, is that I think for a philosopher, the text kind of stands on its own, whereas the philologist is trying to think, well, what was the person thinking maybe when the text was being composed? It reminds me a little bit of the difference between living constitution theorists and originalists. The living constitution stands on its own, and originalists, of course, want to get back and understand what the people were thinking when they wrote the Constitution or the amendments to the Constitution. It's kind of similar to that. So anyway, I think the differences between myself and my beloved teacher partly boil down to the differences between being a philosopher and being a philologist. If I could just kind of summarize everything in like a little sound bite or a middle picture, this is the way I think. I mean, philologists perform an inestimable service for philosophers. They really do. But I think the service is negative as opposed to positive. Let me give you a picture, a mental picture, to explain what I mean. Imagine yourself in a yellow wood and roads diverging, okay? But not two roads, but multiple roads diverging in a yellow wood. Those roads are possible interpretations of a passage set. What the philologist does, and the great service the philologist performs, and Adkins was, one of the best, is the philologist puts up do not enter signs. In other words, these are the things that the language simply will not support. For example, if you think that agathos means moral good, as it does in English when we reply to people, do not enter. If you think that eudaimonia refers to having fun or having feeling pleasure or whether, do not enter. If you think that arete is just a moral concept and not a fulfillment of things function, do not enter, right? So there are all these do not enter signs. And as I say, Adkins was one of the great constructors of do not enter signs. But that still leaves a lot of paths to explore. And so because a philosopher wants to understand or learn something from a text and wants to determine the most plausible and defensible interpretation of the text, then the philosopher wants to pursue those paths that the philologist leaves open and that don't have do not enter signs in front of them. So a good example, for example, is oops, I think we're about out of time, but I'll mention it anyway. The last essay where he's talking about ergon, and does it mean function or does it just mean work? Both are possible. I mean, they're both legitimate translations of the Greek word. There's no do not enter sign there, but you might tend to prefer function given other things. In, for example, the very first words of the Nicomachean Ethics, which make his ethics or set his ethics in a teleological context, for example. And that was his Adkins's essay objecting to a biological interpretation of Aristotle. So, I mean, that's just an example. So in other words, we have a lot of paths that are open, but thank you, Professor Adkins, for putting up those do not enter signs. That is, we owe you and your colleagues an enormous debt of gratitude. And as I said in the beginning, I feel so privileged to have had 5 years of my life learning from one of the great scholars of all time.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Don. I really appreciated your very well organized thoughts, and it was a pleasure talking with you today. Take care.
Sure thing. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.